Raja Omo Esan, the child demigod. Part 2. The day after his ordeal, Cameron finally emerged from his room, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His body ached with every movement, bruises throbbing beneath his skin, each one a painful reminder of the night before. His arm hung stiffly at his side, still tender from the force of his father's blows. He had spent most of the night curled up in the back of his closet, his knees pulled to his chest, listening to the house settle into uneasy silence. Only after he was certain his father had passed out did he dare crawl out, slipping beneath his covers as if sleep could erase the horror of what had happened. But sleep hadn't brought relief. It had only twisted his fears into nightmares, leaving him more exhausted than before. Now, as he stepped into the hallway, the house felt strangely still, the quiet unsettling in its own way. From the living room, the flickering glow of the television cast shifting shadows across the walls. His mother sat curled up on the couch, her focus glued to the screen, the low murmur of dialogue filling the otherwise silent space. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and something sour, like takeout left too long in the trash. She didn't look up at first, but then, sensing his presence, her tired eyes flickered toward him. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice flat, carrying neither warmth nor true concern, just expectation. Cameron didn't answer. He didn't have the energy for her questions, not today. Instead, he turned toward the kitchen, his stomach growling despite the lingering nausea in his gut. Behind him, the couch creaked as she shifted, the soft rustle of fabric filling the silence between them. Then her voice came again, sharper this time. "I know you heard me. Where were you?" Cameron exhaled through his nose, gripping the edge of the counter as he reached for the bread. His movements were slow, methodical, as he pulled out a knife and began spreading peanut butter onto the slice. "I was hiding out in my room," he muttered, finally giving her an answer. She let out a sigh, standing now, arms crossing over her chest. "When your father woke up this morning and saw you were gone, he was livid." There was something clipped in the way she said it, a tightness in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. A warning, a quiet resignation. "You're lucky he's at work." "Lucky." Cameron's grip tightened around the knife, his knuckles going white. He set it down harder than necessary, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. Lucky. That's what she called it. Not having to face the man who had thrown him against the wall. Not having to endure another round of rage disguised as discipline. He was supposed to feel grateful for that. Something inside him snapped. "Why do you let him do this?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp, slicing through the space between them. He turned to face her fully, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "My arm hurts, Mom. My whole body hurts, and all you care about is him?" For a moment something flickered in her expression, something that almost looked like guilt. But just as quickly it was gone, buried beneath the same mask of indifference she always wore. "Don't talk to me like that," she snapped. "Eat your food and stay in your room until dinner." And that was it. That was always it. Cameron bit the inside of his cheek, swallowing back the words clawing their way up his throat. There was no point in arguing. There never was. Without another word, he grabbed his sandwich and stalked out of the kitchen, his steps heavy as he made his way down the hallway. The faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight, the house itself as worn down as the people living inside it. His room was small, the walls bare except for a few peeling posters of superheroes and video game characters. His bed sat against the far wall, unmade, with a pile of comic books stacked beside it. The only window let in a sliver of light, casting long shadows across the floor. He sank onto the mattress, the springs creaking beneath him. The sandwich sat untouched in his lap as he reached for the top comic in the stack, flipping it open with one hand. The familiar illustrations stared back at him, vibrant and alive in a way reality never was. Here, in these stories, people like him, people who were small, overlooked, powerless, became something more. They fought back. They won. His eyelids grew heavy as he turned the pages, his mind drifting between the world of ink and the one outside his door. And eventually, sleep pulled him under, dragging him into restless dreams where fists never landed, where voices never screamed, where he wasn't afraid to fight back. A thunderous slam ripped Cameron from his sleep. His body jerked awake, his pulse hammering as he sat up, disoriented. The room was dark, save for the faint sliver of moonlight creeping through the blinds. His breath came in uneven gasps, his mind sluggish as he tried to register where he was. Then he heard them. The voices. Familiar, sharp, rising. His parents. The argument built like a storm, each word cracking through the silence like lightning. His father's voice was thick, slurred with alcohol, dripping with unchecked fury.
Where's my money, Vivian?
I bought Cameron new clothes and shoes, just like you told me to. Cameron's stomach twisted. That was a lie. She hadn't bought him anything in months. His sneakers had holes in the soles. His shirts barely fit. The only things new in his life were the bruises on his skin. His fingers curled tighter. Why would she lie? Before he could think further, the sharp crack of a slap shattered the air. A choked gasp, the sound of something, glass, breaking. Then his mother's cries, pleading. Cameron's blood turned to fire. He shoved the blankets aside, moving on instinct. His body was still sore, his limbs heavy, but the burning in his chest fueled him forward. He crawled out of the closet, his old hiding place, and slipped into the hallway, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. His father's voice rumbled low, a warning growl before another blow. Cameron's eyes flickered to the broom leaning against the wall, the same one that had betrayed him before. This time, it would be a weapon. Gripping the handle, he crept forward, each step measured, his breath shallow. Then he saw them. His mother was on the ground, her face turned away, blood trickling from her nose. His father loomed over her, his hand raised, fingers curled into a fist, ready to strike again. Something inside Cameron snapped. Without thinking, he lunged. The broomstick sliced through the air, aimed at his father's back. But his father was faster. As if sensing the movement, he spun, his reflexes sharp despite the alcohol clouding his mind. Cameron barely had time to register the fury in his father's eyes before a calloused hand ripped the broomstick from his grasp. Then, pain. A fierce backhand struck Cameron's face, the force sending him crashing into the wooden cabinet behind him. The impact rattled through his already battered body, his injured arm exploding in fresh agony as he slumped to the floor. The room spun, his vision blurred, a coppery taste filled his mouth. Through the haze, he heard his father's low, menacing chuckle. Cameron barely had the strength to lift his head, but when he did, his father was standing over him, a shadow, a monster, and Cameron had no way to fight back. This was a lesson, a slow, deliberate punishment. The air reeked of beer and sweat, the stench suffocating as his father took a step closer. Cameron barely had the strength to lift his head, but when he did, he found himself staring into the man's eyes, small, beady, yet filled with something bottomless, amusement, enjoyment. Think you're a man now? His father's voice was calm, almost mocking. He nudged Cameron's side with his boot, just enough to make him flinch. Attacking your own father with a broomstick? A deep chuckle rumbled from his chest as he crouched down, his face inches from Cameron's. You're as weak as your mother. Cameron's breath hitched. His gaze flickered toward his mother, still on the floor. She hadn't moved. His chest clenched. Blood streaked the side of her face, her lips split open, her nose swelling. Her eyes were barely open, unfocused, staring somewhere far away. A heavy hand fisted in Cameron's shirt, yanking him upright. His body protested, nerves screaming in pain, but his father didn't care. I'm in charge here, he snarled, his breath hot against Cameron's face. I pay the bills and you— A fist slammed into his stomach. Obey! A strike to the ribs. Me! The world swayed as Cameron fought to stay conscious, but the pain was overwhelming, suffocating. His fingers dug into the floor, his mind screaming for something, anything to make it stop. And then, like an answer from the void, the temperature dropped. Pathetic chill slithered through the room, curling around Cameron's battered body like an unseen presence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The air grew dense, charged, as if something had entered the space. Something wrong. Cameron's father must have felt it too, because he hesitated. His eyes darted around the room, his head tilting slightly, like an animal sensing danger. The muscles in his jaw tightened, his bravado cracking just enough for Cameron to notice. A whisper curled around the edges of his mind. "Call me." The words weren't spoken aloud, but Cameron heard them as clearly as if someone had breathed them into his ear. His lips parted, barely a breath escaping. "Raja." The whisper grew stronger, wrapping around him, sinking into his bones. His father turned back to him, his face twisting into something ugly. "What the hell did you just say?" Cameron didn't answer. He couldn't. The darkness creeping at the edges of his vision was swallowing him whole, and just before he blacked out, he saw something shift in the shadows, something watching, something waiting. From the corner of the room, the shadows deepened, swirling together into something other, something wrong. Then Raja stepped forward. The boy, if he could even be called that, moved with eerie grace, his bare feet never quite touching the ground. His thick curls framed his face, wild and untamed, haloed by the inky tendrils of the void itself. His ornate purple coat shimmered, its golden embroidery shifting like it was alive. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was undeniable. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze locked onto Cameron's motionless form. Then, with a single gentle touch, he placed a hand on Cameron's forehead. Warmth bloomed where Raja's fingers met his skin, and in an instant the pain evaporated. The bruises, the aches, the sharp sting of broken flesh, gone. Cameron gasped, his body suddenly weightless, his mind clearing as if waking from a nightmare. Still dazed, he looked up at Raja, his voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't call you." Raja smiled, his expression both knowing and menacing. "Yes, you did." His grin widened, filled with something ancient, something terrifying. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a whisper of power. Cameron didn't hesitate. He nodded. Raja extended a hand, and in his palm materialized a delicate vial, gold-trimmed glass, pulsing with an energy Cameron couldn't name. "A tear and a drop of blood," Raja murmured. Cameron barely registered the movement. His body, guided by something beyond him, let a single tear fall into the vial, followed by a crimson drop from his wounded lip. The vial sealed itself instantly, glowing with an eerie light. "Accept me." Raja's lips moved, but the voice didn't come from him. It came from everywhere. Cameron had no time to react. The moment the words reached him, darkness exploded in his mind. When Cameron opened his eyes, he was no longer inside his body. He hovered above the scene like a specter, weightless, untethered. He could see everything, his father, his mother, the wreckage of their home. But what truly sent ice through his veins was his own body. It was standing, but it was not him. His possessed form faced his father, shoulders squared, his lips curled into something far too confident, far too knowing. His golden-tinged eyes glowed with unnatural intensity. "You've preyed on the weak for too long," his body said, but the voice was not his own. It was deeper, darker, Raja's. His father's expression twisted into something Cameron had never seen before. Pure terror. His body lifted a hand, fingers outstretched, and in that moment Cameron knew his father's fate had been sealed. The room quivered. The air thickened. Then, a scream that wasn't just pain. It was horror. It was the sound of something being unmade. His father's face contorted, muscles twitching as if his skin was being pulled too tight. His hands clenched into fists, then splayed open, his fingers trembling. The air around him shimmered, warping like heat waves rising from pavement. And then, a crack. Not bone, not flesh. Reality itself seemed to fracture. Cameron's father's mouth stretched wider, wider than humanly possible, until it was nothing but a gaping void of terror. His eyes, bloodshot and bulging, locked onto Cameron's, pleading. For the first time in his life, Cameron saw it. Fear. Not in himself. Not in his mother, but in his father. And then, with a final shudder, his father's body went limp, his head lolling back as his weightless form hovered mid-air. The silence was deafening. At that moment Cameron's mother stirred, groaning weakly, but she was too injured to move, but the look of horror and shock crossed her face. She is now witnessing something unexplainable. Before she can open her mouth to say anything, Cameron's father's body crumples to the floor and the house fell into silence. Cameron turned, if turning was even possible in this weightless form, and met Raja's gaze. Raja smiled, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, his golden, burning eyes, held a truth Cameron wasn't ready to face. He's a demon, Cameron thought, but Raja, tilting his head ever so slightly, corrected him. I am not a demon. His voice echoed, surrounding Cameron like a phantom's whisper. I am vengeance. Part 3 coming soon.